All right. Welcome to Bob the Father, everybody. So again, this is an open forum. Any questions you may have, I'll try to answer to the best of my ability. And here we go.
Yeah, just came to learn tonight. Came to learn, kind of,
All right, well, I have a question for you on behalf of my dad, even though I think he answered his own question, but he was curious, and you're not gonna know the answer because I told him nobody does. He wants to know if you think there's time in heaven.
Oh, yeah. I mean, obviously, we don't have that experience. We don't know, but I mean, we do. The church does teach that outside of this realm, right? So the natural world, which is creation, is governed by time and space. Time is a creation of God, right? Space is a creation of God. When we talk about things that are outside of this created world, like purgatory, heaven, hell, that's outside of the realm of time and space. So it's not to say that time maybe doesn't exist, but maybe time isn't a factor, right, outside of this world. So to say that, like, what is a minute in heaven? That's kind of a nonsensical question because it's like, what does it matter?
Apples and oranges.
Yeah, right, exactly, right. What I mean, who cares what a minute in heaven is because you're in heaven, right? Now, where that becomes a little more interesting, I think, is when we talk about purgatory.
Sure, I want to know.
Right, yeah, right. So, I mean, purgatory would still be considered outside time and space. It's not a material place. At least we don't think it is. We don't really know for sure. But what would that mean that I have to spend some time in purgatory? Now, many theologians debate this, right? So there's been some personal revelation of certain saints that kind of see purgatory as this consuming fire, and you kind of spend this time purging yourself of these attachments, and that could take centuries or decades, or maybe you could stay there until the actual second coming of Christ, whenever that is, right? But it's also important to remember that anyone in purgatory is going to heaven, right? So purgatory is not like a waiting room for judgment. That you've already been judged when you're in purgatory. You've been judged redeemed, but not perfect, which is what purgatory is directed to, right? Jesus tells us we have to be perfect as our Heavenly Father is perfect. Well, how does that happen, right? I mean, can that happen on earth? Sure. For a majority of us, it probably doesn't. And so we have this place that or this existence, I probably should say, that we go to where we perfect ourselves, or we are being perfected by the grace of God. Other theologians posit that purgatory can be akin to the parable about the prodigal son. That there's this moment in the parable of the prodigal son where the father sees the son and then runs to him, right? And so that's kind of like a purgatory, right? That there's this running of the father to the beloved son and daughter, who we are, which actually purges us of these things and cleanses us to where we're perfect, right? The truth is we don't know, right? Because when it comes to personal revelation, all we can really say in those aspects is maybe, right? One thing we can say of personal revelation, it can't contradict what the teaching of the church is. And fortunately or unfortunately, there's no definitive teaching when it comes to purgatory, what heaven's like, what hell's like, because, well, we don't know. We're going to find that out. We know there is one, and that's what definitively taught, that there is purgatory, there is hell, there's heaven. What it's like, well, hopefully we find that out, right? Not hell, of course, but, heaven. Right. So yeah, time in purgatory is kind of an interesting concept, because again, if it's outside of eternity, well, maybe it's like instantaneous, right? That I'm perfected in this moment, and then, okay, I'm in heaven. Sure.
Some people might be, depending on their suffering on earth.
Right. And so again, maybe it could be the rest of time we're in purgatory on earth. Okay, but also in purgatory, what is that like? Because again, we're talking about something outside of that. Even heaven, we talk about things that are eternal, like we talk about the sacrifice of Jesus, right? His time on earth. These actions he does on earth are eternal actions, which means they happened, they are happening, and they will happen in heaven. For us, it's like, okay, you might start short circuiting, right? Because because of our experience, we have a chronological experience, right? That we're in this moment right now, but that moment is going to be superseded by another moment, and henceforth and henceforth. In heaven, that's not how it works, right? It's just all at once, and it's eternal. And we actually,
the good, the bad, and the ugly.
well, in heaven it's all the good, right? But on earth we're still seeing it all happening at one time, right? Because we're outside of it. We can observe from a different perspective. We actually commemorate that actually at every Mass, right? That we believe, we understand that the Mass is us able to really and physically witness the sacrifice of Christ and his passion, death, and resurrection. This eternal action of Jesus that we are gifted to become present to, or I should say it becomes present to us at the Mass. That at every Mass, that we are there at the foot of the cross. We are there at the resurrection, at the tomb. We are there at the ascension of Jesus. We are there at Pentecost to go out, right, and spread the good news. It's not like a chronological aspect, but it's an eternal aspect which we make present too. So I know it's hard, right? Because here's the thing. I'm also taking an entire year of philosophical study to bring it down and condense it into this, right?
Okay.
So there's a lot of philosophy, there's a lot of history and tradition based in this. But even then, we don't really necessarily have a definitive answer when it comes to what is that like in heaven. Okay. Let's turn it off for some reason. We talk about when we talk about creation. So the other beautiful thing about being Catholic is that we have these different interpretations, right? And we don't necessarily have to hold one interpretation when it comes to these things like Genesis or like when we talk about the ban being put on people by God in the Old Testament, right? We can have different interpretations and hold them and still call themselves Catholic. So when we talk about like the creation story, okay, well, God made light. Great. That was the first day. Hold on. Wait a second. How do we measure a day? Well, we measure a day from sunrise to sunrise. Okay. When was the sun created again? Well, that was like day 4. Well, then wait a minute. How do we get this day in 2 days and 3 days if we didn't have a sun to actually
create the day?
Yeah, at least measure the day, right? So this God saying, okay, it's 24 hours, that's a day, I'm just going to make that work. Well, also from what perspective, we're talking about East Coast time, we talk about, so again, we can look at these things from a critical standpoint and say, well, maybe it's just a way that the writers, Moses or whoever wrote Genesis, was interpreting the way God works in our life. And even though God definitely has the power to do all this in a 24-hour period, whatever that meant back then, maybe it's just a way for us to understand that he did this in time, that he's the source of it, he's the end of it, and he did it through this series of processes and still remains in our lives even to this day. Great. Which is also why we could say things like, well, yeah, we don't really have a problem with Darwinism, right? That God surely could put a process in place and maintain that process for us to have our bodies developed from lesser organisms. Where we would have to differ with, and Darwin didn't have an answer for this either, is where our intellect comes from, right? We would still have to say there's some source of that is outside of us, that isn't a biological function, it has to be something given. And so we would say, well, that's what makes us distinct, is that we have rational souls. Right. Yeah, so time is a very interesting concept, not just biblically, but also just in general, right? Because even the measure of time is completely left to us, right? When we talk about seconds and minutes, and those are human inventions. Even though God invented time,
yeah, the rising of the sun and the setting.
we invented the measuring of it in some ways, right?
Well, yes,
yeah,
yes, and in this universe. All those synchronized things all fit together perfectly. So me and my faith in that somebody else made us, he's got the same things going on, right? Now, it might not be a round globe and things like that. He's the being ruler, made everything, but He probably wants to lay down for a while and get up for a while. And he made us to have fun. Like everything is from him.
Right.
So everything that he made is going to have things of and like him.
Yeah, and I think that's also good to see that, like, he does everything as an example for us, right? So like even like the Sabbath. Well, okay, wait a minute. God needs rest?
Yeah,
all right. But no, it's not that necessarily God needs rest, but we do. And God, by saying, look, take that day, is for us to understand we need rejuvenation, right? Jesus did in his life, right? We were talking about in the second graders this past week about baptism. And, we talk about how a sacrament is a sign or symbol that gives grace that was founded by Jesus himself while he walked this earth and is ministered by the church, right, through the Holy Spirit. So, okay, so when we talk about like baptism, it was founded by Jesus. When did that happen? Well, his own baptism. Wait a minute, isn't Jesus God? Yeah. Does he need to be baptized? No.
No.
Okay, well then why do you do it?
To show us.
As an example for us, right? Yeah.
To show us.
Right. And so I think you can even make that in more, macro statements, or maybe even like what we call metaphysical statements, that everything he does, goodness and truth and time, is for us. It's a gift for us, right? And so what we do with it when we measure it, well, that's kind of up to us. That's kind of the nature of free will, but it's still given and maintained by him. Yeah, I mean, so yeah, it's kind of very roundabout
But that's
answer.
a great question, because you think our loved ones, we want to pray for them in purgatory to get them out of purgatory. How many years is that? Well, what is it based on? What they did? From my judgment? I shouldn't be, I can't say.
Right.
Yeah.
So do I just keep praying till I pass?
Correct.
yes.
That's the short
Right?
answer. Yeah.
Right?
I mean, so
just keep praying.
and that's the thing. Like, I think that's the other thing about it too. Like that there's a humility in it. That look, I'm going to trust that God is taking care of my loved ones, and if I can help them, I'm going to. Right? That's an act of charity. Right? That's what we all should be driving towards. Right.
Yeah.
And even if my I'll use my aunt as an example. She was my godmother, holy woman, especially later in life. She was at mass every day. She would go to confession, adoration, all the good stuff. I had the honor and the privilege of anointing her before she passed. And I trust that giving her those last rites helped her significantly, especially the apostolic pardon.
Yep.
But also too, there was some time between that moment and the moment she died where, well, I don't know where her head was, but maybe she could have sinned. Maybe it was a moral sin, probably not, but okay, whatever. I'm still going to pray for her because I don't know. And that's the most loving thing I can do for her now, is pray for her. And even if she is in heaven, I'm going to trust that God's going to take those prayers and take those actions, those penances, and do something for somebody else.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. So good.
It's not going to go to waste.
Right, exactly.
Right?
Can never go to waste.
Right.
But yeah, I think that's really, those are actions of humility on our part, because here's the thing: it's we don't know, which is why when we talk about like things like funerals, I try to do this in a way that's comforting in homilies, but also kind of like conveying the truth, right? Is that, look, I don't know if your grandmother's in heaven or not. I don't know. I hope she is. We all hope she is. But I mean, I don't know, which is why we need to pray for her. Right? I will too, but we still need to do that, right? To make a definitive statement like, oh, she's in heaven or he's in heaven. I hope. Sure. I hope. That'd be great. I mean, let's even start a cause. Fine. Whatever. I don't care. But yeah, I don't know that. So I'm going to keep on praying until I find out.
Yeah.
Right. So yeah, that's a difficult thing sometimes, especially when people are mourning. And it's hard because you want to hope, and we should hope that they are, but you also don't want to give a misunderstanding or a mistruth.
Well, people close to their faith feel the truth. My mom, oh my God, she was in church all the time, and later on in life, she's like, well, I don't know if I'm going to heaven. Everybody around her would say, oh, you're definitely going, but she's like, well, I don't know.
Yeah.
We don't.
Well, and I think that's, I think
gotta
that's,
keep
again,
credit.
right. That's a humble approach because, like, we'll have some of our brothers and sisters of other faiths who will say, or other denominations will say, "Are you saved?" And I mean, as a Catholic, our answer, I mean, we should take some pause on that and say, "Well, I hope." Well, aren't you? Well, why aren't you saved? I'm like, well, I know I'm baptized, and I know I practice my faith, and I know I try not to sin, even though I do sin. I'm a sinner. So I hope, and that's the best I can say, because that's not up to me. I mean, it is in some ways, but it's not, right? So, but that comes from a standpoint of once saved, always saved. That those that are profess the once saved, always saved. It's not that they would necessarily say that, okay, I can do whatever I want now because I'm saved, because that doesn't
work that
right. It doesn't work that way. But there are sects that say that well, I'm saved, so I can go and cheat on my wife, and I can go and embezzle money. Well, that doesn't really point to the fact you may be saved. I don't know that either about you, because maybe your understanding may be different about what that is or what sin is, or if you're following your conscience. I don't know your conscience, so maybe your conscience is telling you that. I don't know. I do know that if I were to do that, I'd be putting my mortal soul in jeopardy. So,
but if you think rationally about it, you're trying to get into a place.
Right.
You're gonna go. Are you gonna be accepted? And is your actions and everything when you get in there? Are you going to be proper? Are you going to be accepted?
And that's also, I think, the problem with sola scriptura, fides sola, right? Sola fides, faith alone, right? So it was funny, this past weekend in the gospel, the letter of James, we talked about faith and works, right? And somebody may point to that and say, well, doesn't that contradict Paul? As a matter of fact, we talked about in OCIA that Martin Luther, Augustinian priest, Catholic priest, he wanted to remove James from the canon because it didn't coincide with sola fides. And it was his interlocutors that said, no, you shouldn't do that. That's not, we've been doing this for 1,500 years. It's been there for that long. We probably should not do that. But it does raise an interesting question, because Paul, he does talk about faith, that only faith alone can get us to heaven. But you also have to read Paul in context. So the question with Paul is, who's he talking to? And what's going on in that community that he's talking to, right? So if he's talking to people in Corinth where maybe there's a lack of understanding of faith, that maybe there is a position of, we just have to do good, and keep on doing, working. Well, that's also not healthy either, especially if you're not doing it through your own faith. You're just doing it as a sense of obligation, as an act of charity. And so that's what Paul's saying, is that, well, yeah, our faith is necessary, and it should be primordial. It should be the primary thing. But what flows from that faith is that we actually do good for each other, right? So if I'm a faithful person, I have faith in Jesus, and I have faith that his actions have saved me, I then, through that same faith, should try to mimic those actions, right? And follow him as a disciple of Christ.
And want to do it.
And Paul says the same thing in other letters. And then James really makes that very clear. So, yeah, I mean, that's kind of when we talk about these things, it's always kind of an interesting discussion, because I think a faithful Protestant would say, well, no, I mean, I have my faith, and that should even flow anyway. Well, then, yeah, that's all we're saying as Catholics, is that if you're having faith, your work should actually coincide with that faith, right? And also, we don't do that perfectly because we're all sinners. And to deny that is also denying a fundamental principle and truth, right? And hey, fortunately, we also have something that can help you with that. It's called the sacrament, right? That you can, get forgiven of those things and get help to get better on that. So why don't you give it a shot? Who knows? Whatever, right?
Right.
Yeah. But yeah, these are all discussions with our brothers and sisters that I think are fruitful if they're done right, but also can be somewhat damaging too, especially if you're coming from a place of, I know better than you, or, I think it's good to have some humility in these things too.
Yeah.
Good.
Okay. Good.
Great. Wow.
We get a lot of our furniture from Shipshewana, Indiana, and there's some very fine Amish men. The kind of people with great character. And even there's a gentleman that runs a finishing shop up there who's kind of broken away because there's many of them that believe that just work. And I've gotten close to the guy. We're talking. He goes, and I'm kind of shamed. I don't get along with even my family. We don't go to church with my family now because I think faith is just as great a part to me getting into heaven as just my work. And in the Amish community, that's about the biggest depth I know. But I know all the gentlemen on each side, and they're wonderful people to deal with and visit with. But even the differences travel across the globe and through many colors and faiths and
and I think that's the thing. I mean, here's the thing: you can't necessarily fault anyone either, because I mean, it's interesting. We have these ecumenical discussions, and even working with OCIA. I mean, it's important to kind of point certain things out, but like today you can't say that a faithful Lutheran is a heretic, right? And the reason we can't say that is because, well, the same thing. If I'm raised Catholic and I'm given this particular values and taught a certain way, and I accept that into my heart and mind because it's been given to me, and even maybe repetitively put into me, ingrained, right? Well, okay, that becomes part of my psyche, part of my conscience, part of my being. And so, if someone were to say, "Oh yeah, that Jesus guy, he's not the Son of God," well, proof. Like, what do you got? Like, okay, maybe he's not. Show me, right? Here's how I understand it. Is there something contradictory you can show me that may be true? Ultimately, we believe not, because no. But even from when we come to talk about like ecumenical things, like, okay, well, hey, the Eucharist was given to us by Jesus' Last Supper, and it's actually his body, blood, soul, and divinity. I mean, if you read John 6, or if you read any of the Gospels, or even the fathers of the church, the very first, within a generation after the apostles died, this was being promulgated. So why don't you believe that? Well, because I was raised in a church that said it's more symbolic, and it was really kind of a commemoration of the Last Supper, and I read it this way and I interpret it this way, and we don't really put too much emphasis on the church fathers because, well, they're not the apostles. Yeah, I can understand that. Then okay. Now we can get in deeper discussion about, well, why, but also just from a historical standpoint, if this was being promulgated that early, so are you saying that everyone was wrong from that point on? I mean, so again, I think we have those discussions in very open and charitable ways, but I can't fault someone that doesn't see the Catholic perspective because they've been raised in a certain way.
And you shouldn't.
You shouldn't. No, of course, and that's what the church teaches. I mean, so faithful Lutheran today, we can't say you're a heretic. Now we can go back to maybe the time of Luther and say, you should have known better. But maybe he might be, and maybe some of his people that were following him at the time. I don't want to judge because I was around back then, but maybe we can make that argument. But you, as a faithful Lutheran today, well, hey, praise God, you're worshiping God, and we have at least some understanding we can come to, right? So yeah, that's I think kind of an interesting perspective that is a little bit different, and kind of was one of the fruits of Vatican II in many ways, right? So I think that was always kind of an open question for a long time after Trent about, well, what do we do now with all these Protestants, right? How do we engage with them? And I think unfortunately the church kind of took a tact of don't, let the high churchmen deal with that, right? So like today we celebrated St. Robert Bellarmine, right? It was his feast day today, and he along with his contemporary St. Francis of Sales were really made great leeway into their dialogue and with other Protestants, and kind of were able to overcome a lot of the Protestant objections and bring people back to the faith. Praise God. But not every bishop and cardinal were like that.
No.
Right? So, I think in some dioceses it was just like, yeah, they're over there, we're going to let them go, and they're just going to, if they want to come back, we're here, but And I think for about 500 years that was kind of attacked. And then I think one of the great things about Vatican II, it kind of opened up that dialogue again, so we can actually come to an understanding. And what's I think fascinating about that too is, from those dialogues, we actually have a definition of the church that actually accepted by these other denominations. And what's kind of fascinating about it is the definition that many denominations have accepted as how to define a church are a group of people centered around their bishop in baptism and the Eucharist. Now, what that points out is several things. First off, people, yes, apostolic succession. That a bishop has been given that authority handed down by bishop, all the way back to the apostles. And then, of course, one needs to be baptized to be within the church, and also focused on the Eucharist. Very Catholic things we're talking about here.
Very.
But
not all
Lutherans,
Christians,
right?
yeah.
But Lutherans, Anglicans, Baptists, and others have accepted that as a definition. Now we may discuss like, what do you mean by Eucharist? What do you mean by baptism? What do you mean by whatever? But that's kind of fascinating. And they even the agreement that those who do not have those things are not churches, but maybe they can be considered ecclesiastical communities. That all came from dialogue that happened after Vatican II. So I think that's kind of fascinating. So I don't know. It's an interesting discussion. Hopefully we have more, and then we can get to some kind of commonality.
Yeah.
Great. Anything else?
Not from this side of the table.
Okay. All right. Well, hey, we can. That's fine.
Awesome.
All right. Thanks for coming, guys. Appreciate it.
Sure.
Have a good night.
Thank you.